What's this happening in Ukraine? Could it be something that looks like normal politics, like a protest by some people outside government buildings? What they're protesting against is some changes to the organisation of the country's anti-corruption programmes, pushed through, his critics say, by the President Volodymyr Zelensky. What does it mean for his leadership of Ukraine during the war? We will answer that question and several others on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. Now, if you've been watching the news from Ukraine since Russia's invasion or listening to our sister podcast, Ukrainecast, you would think that actually there hasn't been much kind of normal, classic politics happening in Ukraine of the type you could imagine happening in a country that isn't at war. Well, over the last day or so, that has changed because there have been some protests in Kyiv and elsewhere in Ukraine about some changes the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has, some people would say, forced through or rushed through to the country's anti-corruption organisations. And quite a few people are not happy about it, and they've gone out to protest about it, which could have potential consequences for Zelensky's presidency and may have its roots in the war and how it's been fought in Ukraine over the last couple of years. So let's try and unpick all of this and work out where it might be going. And we'll do that now because we're joined by my podcasting brother-in-law, Vitaly Shevchenko from Ukrainecast, who is in Turkey. Hello, Vitaly.
Good afternoon.
And also here in the Newscast studio with me is Orysia Lutsevych from the Chatham House think tank. Hello, Orysia.
Great to be here for the first time for me.
Yeah, welcome. Welcome anytime. Vitaly, before we dive into this news story, just explain why you're actually in Turkey today. What's happening there?
Third round of talks between Russia and Ukraine. There was a bit of uncertainty initially about when exactly they're happening. Is it Wednesday? Is it Thursday? Is it later this week? But a few hours ago, we finally learned that it is Wednesday. Delegations are up in the air as we speak on the way to Istanbul, and the talks are happening this evening, which is slightly unusual. Before that, it was during the day, but it's still interesting.
Orysia, give us a bit of a reality check about this round of talks. Like, should we be getting our hopes up for a resolution, or is this all a bit performative? What's just a way of thinking about it that's smart?
Well, there's a saying, hope dies last. So I think we should always be hoping because the war has such an enormous toll on Ukrainian society, cities. There's an exhaustion. People are seeking for this light in the end of the tunnel. But I think there's quite strong realization that there is a summer military offensive that Russia is trying to mount really hard, making very small incremental successes on the battlefield in the east, but heavily bombarding the cities. And Ukrainians do not believe it can stop anytime soon, unlikely after these talks tonight.
Vitaly, what's the best case scenario for when these talks end then, what they'll come up with?
Well, realistically, Adam, I think we're going to get an announcement of more prisoner exchanges. And, well, to be honest, all this time I've been battling what I think is misplaced optimism about these talks. In fact, I won a beer from a colleague at the BBC who shall remain unnamed because he was so excited about the first round, and he said, well, yeah, this is the beginning of the end of the war. I'm not sure. Russia and Ukraine are still miles apart. There's no chance that they'll suddenly sit down together and thrash it out, and this will lead to peace anytime soon. Ukraine wants a ceasefire and a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Russia's saying, no, too early for any of that. Let's talk about our memorandum. And that memorandum they presented to the Ukrainians the last time they were here on the 2nd of June, and it's essentially a demand for surrender. There's no chance that Ukraine is going to agree to that. So I think realistically and hopefully prisoner exchanges, but little hope for anything more fundamental than that.
And prisoner exchanges is something both sides have been able to agree on before. Right, Orysia, let's talk about what these protests that have been happening in Ukraine in the last day or so. Before we talk about the criticisms of Zelensky that is leading to the protests, what is the actual changes that he's making that is getting people annoyed?
So what has happened in the parliament yesterday was a very rushed adoption of the law that curtails the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor. So it was very convoluted. It was almost like MPs and Zelensky's team did not want people to know what they are doing. The bill was not properly reviewed by the MPs. They didn't have time. Normally they have these tables where they compare the amendments. It was done unbelievably fast from the moment it was voted to the moment it was signed by the speaker to the moment it was signed by Zelensky. And what triggered protest is the feeling, especially among the Ukrainian young people, those who are working hard in the home front to maintain economy, that somebody is stealing their European future. People know that anti-corruption agenda is very prominent on the Brussels agenda, and they fear that this may jeopardize Ukraine's membership perspective.
Okay, Vitaly, just then expand on so we've talked about why people are angry about the process and about what it sort of symbolizes, but the actual changes to the anti-corruption organizations, just spell out for us really clearly what Zelensky has changed there.
Let's rewind 10 years back when these key anti-corruption agencies were set up at Ukraine's Western allies' insistence and under their supervision. They were independent. They, as far as we knew, they came under no political influence. So the biggest change is that they are effectively subordinated now to Ukraine's chief prosecutor general, and that prosecutor is a Zelensky loyalist. And now that prosecutor can reassign anti-corruption cases investigated by those agencies to potentially more loyal or pliant prosecutors, and he can even close them. So this essentially, undermines their independence and their authority. And as Orysia said, this sounds shockingly similar to where Ukraine was before the Euromaidan revolution. It flies right in the face of 10 years of efforts to fight corruption and for democracy. At least that's what critics of this law say. And they say, look, this is where it started more than 10 years ago. We thought this was our future, democracy, no corruption, and now this happens. And one protester in Kiev yesterday, he was holding this poster, "This is not what my father died for." And that poster is really sticking out in my memory. I think it symbolizes the essence of the situation. This is not what Ukrainians have been hoping for the past 10 years.
And Orysia, help us get perspective here about how big these protests are. It's an unusual thing to see when Ukraine's at war. We've not really seen it before, but just help us get it in perspective.
Yes, it's the first protest around the social issue about the institutional reform that is taking place since the full-scale war started. And it's taking place not just in Kyiv, but in Lviv, in Dnipro, and even in Sumy, that is under constant shelling of Russian artillery. I think what is significant also is how young the protest is, how many women are there. And also it's a mix of women and veterans, those who already served and are decommissioned for one or the other reason. They feel like they have responsibility to ensure that Ukraine remains on track of that European pathway. And it doesn't come to me as a big surprise, to be honest. It was just the last drop that overflown the patience of Ukrainian citizens, because we've seen like a chain of events specifically related to the anti-corruption agenda. I just came back from Ukraine's recovery conference in Rome, and right on the eve of that conference, there was a very controversial cancellation of an appointment for the Bureau of Economic Security, which is something that Ukraine also has to reform, that is currently part of Ukraine's security services. After an independent commission that appointed the person, the cabinet of ministers canceled this appointment, and Ukrainian civil society, anti-corruption watchdogs were outraged that this has happened. Just one instance, and it continues. Zelensky seems to be undermining the anti-corruption agenda.
And not just that, but it seems that some people are accusing Zelensky of using the corruption laws to basically silence or get rid of his political opponents, and using corruption as a way of making his life a bit easier politically.
Well, let's also remember that there's a predicament of post-Soviet societies, which is often called a selective prosecution. There's been a Ukraine's curse since its independence. We may recall a very controversial trial of Yulia Tymoshenko during Yanukovych's presidency that also jeopardized.
She was the opposition leader, yeah.
She was the former prime minister, the opposition leader. She was imprisoned for a political decision that should not have been a criminal investigation. And she was an opponent. There was also, there are many cases against former President Poroshenko that were started by Zelensky when he came to office. He's even on the sanction list. And this is viewed as a certain political prosecution of the leader of the major opposition party.
Vitaly, what's it like reporting on what looks like kind of normal politics, but in a country that's at war?
It's strange. I think it's worth mentioning why the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky's associates are saying why they're doing it. And they say that these anti-corruption agencies have been infiltrated by Russian agents, to which critics of this law say that it's just an excuse. It's just an excuse, and possibly these anti-corruption investigators were getting closer to uncovering corruption by somebody within Zelensky's inner circle. The fact is, Adam, we don't know. There's no evidence to support any of those claims and counterclaims. What is certain, and this is what we know, and this is what makes the whole situation so abnormal, is that this controversy, this row, threatens the social contract, if you like, that we've seen emerge in the wake of the full-scale invasion by Russia, where society united around Zelensky, even though certain members of that society may not be huge fans of him, they were perfectly ready to set their differences apart because there's a war on. We need to unite to fight Russia. And now, as the protest last night showed, now that social contract is under strain, and people are saying, look, you are targeting what we have been fighting for, what our brothers, sisters, fathers, and mothers have been fighting for. This is not okay. And also, Ukraine's allies from the West, such as the EU and ambassadors from the G7 group of nations, they have been expressing concerns, and they've been saying, look, our support for you, the Ukrainian government, our assistance to you is conditional on progress that you make in fighting corruption. This is what we started 10 years ago. What's going on now? And the threat to Ukraine at this stage is that there will be even less will on the part of the West to keep supplying money and weapons to Ukraine because of all this controversy around the key issue of corruption that has blighted Ukraine for many decades.
Okay, Orysia, I mean, does this make it harder for Keir Starmer to say we're going to carry on sending billions in financial aid to Ukraine and loads of weapons?
Yes, and not only for Keir Starmer, but also for IMF and also for the EU Commission. Let's remember that Ukraine is heavily dependent on direct macro-financial assistance. Basically, Ukraine needs to fill in its budget hole, which is roughly 40 billion, a year, depending on how it goes. And next year, Ukraine still misses about 20 billion in the pipeline.
But hang on, aren't those organisations and those governments going to turn a blind eye to the rule of the technicalities of the law about corruption if actually you've still got Russia invading the country?
This is a very, very good question. And if you ask me, Ukrainian society would be very disappointed if Ukraine's Western partners turn a blind eye, because this is exactly like Vitaly described, something that people, when protesting back in 2012, 2013, and they knew that what Ukraine needs is a strong rule of law framework, because impunity is something that is flourishing, and corruption kills. This was one of the slogans before, and right now, literally, if Ukraine doesn't get all these influx of money and military assistance, a lot more people will die, and it will be a personal responsibility of Zelensky. I think he has cornered himself with this agenda. Whoever put on the table this plan for him explained probably it's a genius plan, but the way it's interpreted in Ukrainian society will have a huge impact on his own political future. And I think if Ukraine's EU integration is stalled, and if Ukrainian budget is in deficit, and if Ukrainian economy is spiraling, with inflation and macroeconomic instability, people will remind him that this is the reason why this is happening.
Well, yeah, and what could the long-term consequences of this be for Zelensky's position?
Well, I think if, as I described, if Ukraine's European future is not progressing, if the Brussels talks are stalled, and moreover, if Ukraine is losing more territory because people understand that Ukrainian partners are turning away from Ukraine simply because it's not, democracy and it's not abiding by a clear division of powers between the legislative, executive, and judiciary, then I think it will be very hard, not just for Zelensky, but anybody affiliated with this invention and this system to have any future in Ukraine.
And Vitaly, not to be overly dramatic, but could this ultimately lead to Zelensky's fall, or maybe less dramatically, calling elections, which have been delayed because of the war?
Elections-wise, frankly, I don't really see it happening, because for that to happen, so many things will need to change, such as Ukrainian laws, and also how do you hold elections when you're being bombed? How do you take ballot boxes to the trenches? It's going to be really, really difficult. But for Zelensky, one point of view that I've been hearing a lot about Ukraine is that it's black and white. It's easy to see who's right and who's wrong, and everything else is kind of a footnote that will be dealt with once this war is over. And right now, so many people are saying that Zelensky's legacy is under threat. It's not as black and white as it was before this law was passed. So what this means for the war effort, this is really critical. If Zelensky begins to struggle to mobilize support domestically, to mobilize support globally for the war effort, who's going to win? Of course, it plays into Russia's hands. And that's one reason why all those institutions in the West, such as the European Commission and the G7 group of nations, who have voiced concern about what's been happening to Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure, they, I think, will be reluctant to take any immediate sanctions against Ukraine, i.e. reducing aid to Ukraine right now, because they will know that by punishing Ukraine, they will benefit Russia.
Orysia, you chaired an event with Zelensky when he was in the UK a few weeks ago. I mean, how did he seem?
Well, at that event, he seemed, very relaxed and engaging. And I was quite impressed that he agreed to have it under the rule and to speak freely with a group of, media and experts.
Because we should say the
and
Chatham House
Yes.
rule is that you talk very candidly, but
Yes.
the deal is it doesn't go beyond the four
No,
walls.
actually, that's not the rule. The rule
Oh, okay.
you can spread the information without attribution. So I can tell you what we've discussed in the meeting. We've discussed the enormous increase in drone bombardments, the sheer number of drones that Russia is launching and what it means for the war. We talked about the role of Iran and North Korea in supporting Russian war effort. We touched upon China, but also people asked questions about the kind of red tape for investors who want to invest in Ukraine's defense tech and industrial base. We talked about the morale inside Ukraine. I think Zelensky understands that Ukraine is successful because there was that unity between the political leadership, armed forces, and the home front, Ukrainian private sector mainly, not just, employing people, paying taxes, but also, let's not forget, donating, buying equipment for brigades, supporting the frontline effort of the employees who are mobilized. So it is a real fusion of all those actors that gave Ukraine strength to keep resisting such a powerful enemy. And I think that I have a feeling that Zelensky is taking it too much for granted. He is, when he travels abroad, he's very well received. He's received like a war hero. He's showered with this veneration, to be honest. But at home, people are much more discerning. And I think what Vitaly spoke about, the breaking of the social contract, it means that right now there has been a certain red line that's been crossed, and Ukrainian, both civil society, local community leaders, media will be much more vocal about problems at home. Yes, this plays into Russian hand, but it's also being honest. And I think Ukrainian society values that honesty more than risks that it poses of certain fissures inside Ukraine.
I was there at that meeting at Chatham House as well. I don't know if you will agree, Orysia, but to me, it sounded as though Volodymyr Zelensky was the most cheerful person in the room. Before he entered into that big hall. Everyone was like, the mood was somber. We are about to talk to the leader of a nation that's fighting for its survival, and it was slightly, a feeling of concern was hanging in the air. But when he entered the room, he was all smiles. He made jokes. I thought he even flirted with people. He kept talking and answering questions happily, chirping away. And I thought, what is it that he knows that we don't know that makes him so different? Or is he still an actor? And I thought towards the end of the evening, his cheerfulness infected, people in the audience as well. But Volodymyr Zelensky, despite the war, I think he is doing a pretty good job of broadcasting this image of confidence and optimism.
Right, last question for both of you. Now, if you're not a Ukraine watcher, this corruption stuff today will maybe come as a bit of a surprise, even though it is very significant. You two are Ukraine watchers. What's something else that's bubbling away that could become very significant soon that you'd like to just point out to us? Orysia?
Well, I think what we should be watching carefully is the summer campaign, how well Ukraine can hold the front line, because it's being hollowed out by Russia's constant infantry poking and seeing where they can make an inroads. It's hard to predict how strong or weak it is, but I think Putin is making a really strong push this summer because he understands his steam is also running out, and he wants to take as much territory and pressure as much Ukraine at the negotiating table as possible. And also, I think what's going to happen next winter, whether Russia will still keep bombarding Ukrainian energy infrastructure and whether that will that will actually push people to leave more Ukraine because they're concerned. I mean, Kyiv right now is under strong bombardment, and a lot of people are moving to the west of the country. There's an evacuation taking place, parts of Sumy. There's a lot of disturbance inside Ukraine that is bubbling and that could cause certain, trouble for Ukraine.
Vitaly?
Bubbling away. Well, here we are waiting for talks to take place over there about how this war might end or how many prisoners might be exchanged. But as Orysia says, the reality on the ground is frightening. People are still dying every day and every night, and you don't really get to hear that in the news. And also, the Russian army's progress is incredibly slow, incredibly costly, but they are advancing. Just this morning I checked reports and it looks like the Russians are, half an hour down the road from my home city of Zaporizhia. And that's not something you will hear either in Ukrainian mainstream news or let alone in the West. So despite this Russian advance being slow, the fear that you hear sometimes in Ukraine is that it might lead to a breaking point of some sort and a collapse of the front line, especially as Ukraine's allies, or the countries that we're so used to calling allies, they're still talking about what to supply to Ukraine, how much of it, when, who's paying for it, as people are dying. That's the tragic truth about the situation in Ukraine that we must remember.
Vitaly, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Orysia, thanks to you too.
Thank you for this conversation.
Now, 2 city traders who were sent to jail 10 years ago for manipulating a particular interest rate have had their convictions overturned. Now, that's not something that happens in the UK every day. And also it feels like the real end of an era that began with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009. And this has been a real saga. But one of my colleagues basically has dedicated the last 15 years of his life to reporting on this saga. And he's here now. And it's Andy Verity, who's the BBC's financial investigations correspondent. Hi, Andy.
Hiya.
I just had to read your new job title.
Yeah, I know, it's long, isn't it?
Yeah, all those panoramas and the secret papers you've been looking at, now turn it into a whole job.
Now I've got it officially as my role, so there's no excuse for the BBC not to let me do it.
Yes. Now, you have literally written the book on the LIBOR scandal.
I have.
So I wonder if we should just go back to the start, because the whole saga is kind of just worth exploring and explains how we got here.
Yeah.
So first of all, what was LIBOR?
LIBOR until last year, and for 40 of the last years, was the index that tracked the cost of borrowing cash. So it's a bit like the FTSE 100 or the Dow Jones tracks the prices of shares. There's an index which keeps track of how much it's costing banks to borrow cash, which in turn dictates, actually, how much it's going to cost for your mortgage. The interest rates on your mortgage are dictated not so much by the official rates we report every month from the central banks, but actually by the cost of getting hold of those funds to the banks in the money market. The way LIBOR keeps track of that cost is 16 banks every morning for 40 years put in an estimate of how much they thought it would cost to borrow cash, the interest rate they thought they'd have to pay. Now, when they're doing that, of course, there's more than one accurate answer to that question. At what interest rate could you borrow cash? If you think if you were answering that question, how would you set about it? At what interest rate could you, Adam, go and borrow cash? Well, you'd go out to the high street. Maybe Lloyds would have 3.54%. Maybe Barclays would have 3.56%. And you'd make your choice. But they're all accurate answers to that question. At what interest rate can you borrow cash? So how do you choose between them? Now, you could just roll the dice. You could flip a coin. Or you could do what the banks did for a long time, was trying to check out whether they prefer it to be high or low. They had trades on which were linked to these benchmarks, LIBOR and Euribor, so they'd be facing one way or the other. So every morning just before 11 a.m, traders who are looking after those trades would get in touch with the boys on the cash desks, generally boys, I'm afraid,
Yes,
who would put in their estimates and say, we prefer a high LIBOR today or a low LIBOR today. That was common city practice for 20, 30
And they
years.
nudge it in that direction.
And one of the stunning things about the whole scandal is that everybody was doing it. No one thought it was bad. There were no laws or rules banning it. And yet years later, it was retroactively criminalized in order to punish bankers. Now, those prosecutions didn't come out of victims saying, I've been defrauded, complaining to the police. They came out of a political firestorm.
Right. So that's the bit I hadn't quite joined the dots of. So how did it emerge then that there was an, air quotes, scandal around LIBOR?
Well, it was first in 2007, and actually a guy called Peter Johnson at Barclays, who was a cash trader, came back from holiday one day, August 2007. The credit crunch is on. No bank's lending to any other bank. So no one really knows.
Before the big financial crisis in 08, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. When everyone realised how much money they'd lost on subprime mortgages, all the banks were staring at each other thinking, I don't know how much I've lost, I don't know how much you've lost, so I daren't lend to you in case you can't pay me back in case you're not there next week. That was the credit crunch. And what it meant was that the cost of borrowing cash had skyrocketed, but banks were afraid of telling the truth about that in their LIBOR estimates of the cost of borrowing cash, which were public, because it might make them look weak. So they pretty much all started lying. And Peter Johnson came back from holiday and saw that there was something wrong. Banks were going into the market and borrowing at one rate up here and then claiming that they could borrow at a much cheaper rate. It was called lowballing, and it was way out. It was a proper fraud, misrepresenting the cost of borrowing cash. Then, in spite of his protests, he was ordered to lowball himself by his bosses at Barclays and then by the Bank of England and the UK government. Now, that information was suppressed throughout these criminal trials. But a few years ago for Panorama, I got hold of a secret audio recording that implicated the Bank of England of his boss telling him the Bank of England and the UK government had ordered him to put his LIBORs down, even though it would be lying, and he better get on and do it anyway.
Because they thought that would be the best thing for the economy and the government's finances and like society overall.
Yes, Paul Tucker got in touch with Bob Diamond,
who was the deputy governor of the Bank of England at that point.
Paul Tucker was the deputy governor of the Bank of England. He'd been talking to Downing Street, including a guy called Jeremy Hayward and someone at the Treasury, Tom Scholar, who was the second permanent secretary, who'd all been worried that Barclays' LIBOR rates seemed high. Was this an indication that they were in trouble? Were they having to bid up the market and pay more in interest because they were about to go under, just like Northern Rock? Should they have nationalised him? You may remember a couple of weeks before that, October 08, RBS and Lloyds were nationalised, but not Barclays. Whitehall was worried maybe they should have done. When they saw the rates being high, they thought, oh, maybe they're weak. So Paul Tucker, sensing this, gets in touch with Bob Diamond, the boss of Barclays at the time, and says, you better get your LIBOR rates down. Bob Diamond, desperate to avoid nationalisation, passes the message down the chain to Mark Dearlove, the boss of Peter Johnson, who then orders him to lowball. Now, Peter Johnson told the FBI this in 2010. I've got the transcript of his interview, but the FBI chose to keep it quiet. And instead of going after the LIBOR rigging ordered from the top, which is on a much greater scale, they decided to go after the traders instead. And what both the US courts and the UK courts have now ruled is that those prosecutions were completely misconceived. The evidence against the traders, unlike the real scandal, lowballing, was actually just normal commercial quoting.
Right. So that's kind of like the meta-narrative of what was really going on here. But in the meantime, you had these two guys, Tom Hayes and Carl Palumbo, who were jailed in the UK after being found guilty of this. They're the guys that were challenging their convictions.
That's
today.
right. That's right. So I skipped a bit of the timeline, actually. After the 2008 crisis and all the fury with the banks and no banker being punished, when Barclays was fined in 2012 for rigging LIBOR and Euribor, not only did Bob Diamond have to resign, but there was a huge public outcry and MPs started demanding bankers be jailed. Some of our colleagues were on the TV saying the public want to see bankers in like perps, in the perp walk with the handcuffs on their wrists. Such was the public anger at the time towards the banks, suppressed from the financial crisis and deflected from the top of the system down onto these traders' heads. So Tom Hayes, who has severe ASD, Asperger's, it was called at the time, was the first to be tried in 2015. Someone who couldn't communicate very well and who wound up the jury because he kept on repeating that he wanted to see his trading book so he could confirm that it was not greed that made him do this. He couldn't have made any money out of it. And he wasn't allowed to do that. And the judge told the jury that what he did was unlawful as a matter of law, rather than leaving it as a matter of fact for the jury to decide. And it's that the Supreme Court has now decided.
Oh, so the it's called the direction, isn't it? That
Yes.
the judge gives to the jury before they go to the jury room and do their deliberations about
Yes.
guilty or not guilty.
Yes.
So the court today said that direction from the original judge
Yes.
was not right.
Exactly. So the judge usurped the role of the jury, because the jury should be the one who decides about matters of fact. By deciding matters of fact as matters of law, all these emails, if you've done them, are unlawful, the trial felt like a bit preordained. And then all that was left for the jury to be convinced of was that Tom Hayes had behaved dishonestly. And for various reasons, he'd made confessions of dishonesty to avoid extradition to the United States, confessions which he didn't really believe. Like all of life, it's complicated. But 37 traders were prosecuted for this. Now the US courts and the UK courts have said basically it wasn't a crime.
Amazing. I mean, the two guys we're talking about today, they were in jail for half a decade?
Yeah, Tom Hayes was initially given a sentence of 14 years, which is more than some people get for killing someone. And that was reduced on appeal to 11. That was the longest sentence. In this country, when you're halfway through your sentence, if you're a good boy, you can be released on license, which he was. So he emerged from jail in 2021. The others had sentences, some of years, some of shorter times, but they also have time in jail. And in a way, in terms of the length of their sentences, it's worse than the post office, for example. Not as wide as the post office, and of course the characters aren't as sympathetic. They were overpaid bankers. They've had their lives destroyed now, and they don't have money now, but they were overpaid at the time. Part of the calculation may have been, if we prosecute these guys, who's going to be on their side? And anyway, they'd all been roundly condemned in public by politicians without being named as these greedy rogue traders. So it was partly as an interest in that, I thought, well, no one's heard their side of the story.
I suppose, though, for like real justice here, you would need to have the people who were making the big calls and the organizations that were sort of retrospectively making something a crime when it originally wasn't held to account.
Yes, and
is that going to happen?
You have some measure of that today in the Supreme Court's criticism of the judges in the lower courts, who've been quite severely critical of them. There was less criticism of the Serious Fraud Office, who had all this evidence of lowballing ordered from the top and ignored it to prosecute the traders, or the Department of Justice in the United States. But I think one thing that MPs like David Davis and John McDonnell, who've made common cause over this, will be asking is, why was all this evidence covered up throughout their trials? And also, there's a more profound question here. In the United States, a judge ruled that actually what the banks had done here is outsourced their investigation to the targets of their investigation. So rather than actually investigating the banks themselves, they said to the banks, hey, we're going to investigate you. Could you pay for lawyers to look into it yourself? Surprise, surprise. Those lawyers don't end up implicating the bank's bosses who are paying them, but instead some traders down the ranks. And that outsourcing, or if you like, privatizing of the investigative process is fraught with legal difficulty.
Yeah. I mean, has this got kind of long-term consequences for how our financial institutions work now?
I think it should have some of those consequences. And certainly there are MPs, the traders, their lawyers feel that something big has to change about that. That not only has the justice system not worked very well here, but also the way in which those prosecutions were outsourced and privatized has led to what they regard as an awful stitch-up over 10 years. And another thing the Supreme Court said was the Court of Appeal had blocked the path to the Supreme Court. So the traders first appealed in 2015. Each time they appealed 5 times.
Yeah.
The Court of Appeal said, no, we're not letting it go up to the Supreme Court because we don't think there's a point of law of public importance at stake. Well, now we know there clearly was. Why is it that the Court of Appeal can mark its own homework rather than it being pushed up to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, though how you end up like reforming how the Court of Appeal works, I'm not really sure how you even do that, because like the judiciary's it's not subject to the government can't instruct the judiciary what to do.
No, I suppose, but if it was once formed, maybe it can sometime be reformed.
Yeah, interesting. When you chat to people in the city now, has there been a sort of long-term effect of all of this on how people behave in the city? And I use the city as a sort of metaphor for everyone who works in financial services. It's all over the place.
Well, the weird thing is that now almost all the scandals that were prosecuted, that bankers were prosecuted for, one is manipulating interest rates, LIBOR and Euribor, another is manipulating foreign exchange rates. All of those convictions have now been thrown out. So the things that people were prosecuted for turn out to be normal commercial practice. The prosecutions have been misconceived. The real skullduggery, which is out there, of course, remains unprosecuted. So unfortunately, the message might be, even if you keep your nose clean, even if you do what your boss tells you, even if you only do normal commercial practice, in fact, you and I, the things that we do at the workplace, anyone listening, what they do at the workplace, something they regard as ordinary and routine, like these traders did, years from now, someone could turn around and say, we think that was bad. We're going to retrospectively criminalize it. And you could be hauled up before a court. That is the most unsettling thing the traders say about what's happened to them in what they regard as a Kafkaesque nightmare.
And just to take it back to like the very human level, like Tom and Carlo, the two guys we're talking about today, like what are their lives like now? Just give me a sense of like what they've lost, what they've given up, what they've had to live through.
Well, I mean, Tom was funny about this. He just said, I don't know how I feel. I feel like I did when I was convicted. I don't really feel like it's me it's happening to. So it's that kind of, it'll take a while to digest. He said he wanted to go into a dark room and just think about what happened to him, or be by a body of water. Being in prison has had that effect that he loves nature and really treasures it now. Carlo Palumbo, I mean, he's just said it destroyed his relationship with the world. The experience of having a young jury condemn him and seem to enjoy doing so at the urging of authority when he knew he was innocent has been so shattering for him. And he said things like, it's as with the post office, people's families sometimes don't believe them. How do you deal with it when people think there's no smoke without fire? You can rant about your innocence as much as you like, but it's quite crushing for people if they don't believe it. And that's why the official recognition that their trials were unfair is so valuable to them.
Now, some quite scathing things have been said by various people about various institutions in all of this. What do they say, like the Serious Fraud Office, the Bank of England?
Well, the Bank of England, funnily enough, say, well, LIBOR wasn't regulated at the time. They don't deny involvement. They just say LIBOR wasn't regulated. The Serious Fraud Office say, well, look, we had all these appeals. We went through all the right processes, and actually 2 people pleaded guilty and the convictions were upheld until now. So they're defending their role that way. The US Department of Justice has said long ago that it's letting all of these convictions go and overturning all of them, including that of the indictment against Tom Hayes. The UK Treasury has said it didn't try to make banks post false LIBOR rates. And the other players in the scandal, like Barclays, have typically just declined to comment.
Andy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we did an episode of Old Newscast recently, looking back at the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which was one of the key moments in the financial crisis. And if you would like to go back and listen to that, we will put a link in the show notes so that you can find it nice and easily. And if you like the concept of Old Newscast, well, I've got new news for you. Throughout the summer, over the weekends, we are going to be putting new episodes of Old Newscast in the feed. So you will hear about the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. You will hear about the MP's expenses scandal and many other momentous moments from our recent history, but done in the style of Newscast. So that will be heading your way very soon. But heading your way before that will be another classic episode of Newscast, which we will do, well, tomorrow. Bye.